I spent 7 nights on one of the most iconic ships in the world for a trip that has been on my bucket list for such a long time. I boarded Queen Mary 2 in New York City for a 7-night trip that would bring me all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Southampton in England. This trip covers a total distance of over 3,000 nautical miles, and I could not wait for everything that lay in store. I've recently been fortunate enough to discover a number of different Cunard ships. First, I spent a few nights on board the Queen Elizabeth II, or the QE2, which launched back in 1967 and is now a floating hotel in Dubai. I followed this with a stay on the Queen Mary, which is now a floating hotel in Long Beach, California. She launched even earlier in 1934, and it's amazing to see how both of these restoration projects are completely different to each other. If you'd like to see more from onboard either of these ships, just head to the description of this video where I'll provide you with the links to all of my content from my time on board. After seeing both of those historic ocean liners firsthand, I then took a 2-week cruise on board Cunard's Queen Elizabeth, which is a much more modern cruise ship, for a trip that would take me from California on the west coast of the USA through the Panama Canal and over to Florida. We'll come back to this ocean liner versus cruise ship topic shortly, because it is really interesting and it's very important when we're moving on to talk about Queen Mary 2. Before boarding Queen Mary 2 for my Transatlantic Crossing, I had a number of concerns. First, I was worried that the Queen Mary 2 was going to be an incredibly formal ship, and I was really concerned that I maybe wouldn't think I was fitting in as a result. Second, I was worried about the motion. I took this cruise in the middle of winter. I had previously cruised the Atlantic before on a cruise ship from Virgin, but this route was much further north, and I was worried that we'd be in for quite a bit of rough weather, and I would end up feeling pretty unsettled as a result. Finally, I was a bit worried that I would get bored. I boarded the ship in New York on the Friday, and I would dock in Southampton the following Friday, and there were no planned stops in between. I use the word planned here because we weren't meant to stop anywhere, although in reality we did, but I'll come back and tell you more about that shortly. Would I get on board the ship? And would I end up wishing that I was back on dry land? Well, I did have similar concerns on the Virgin Transatlantic a few months before that I mentioned a second ago, but they ended up not materialising. However, a cruise with Cunard is very different to a cruise with Virgin, so I guess the only way for me to find out was to put my nerves aside and to get on the ship. In this video, I'm going to share with you an overview of my crossing on Queen Mary 2, and also offer you my full review of this amazing trip on this pretty amazing ship. Without a doubt, this experience was totally different to any cruise that I've taken before, and I can't wait to show you exactly why. Let's start by talking about the ship and the things that make her different to the rest of the industry, and also pretty unique for this specific route that we're talking about today. One of the reasons why a transatlantic crossing on board Queen Mary 2 has been on my bucket list for so long is that she's the last remaining ocean liner in the world. So it makes sense now to spend a bit of time talking about how ocean liners and cruise ships actually differ. Most cruise ships are designed for pleasure cruises or round-trip itineraries from and to the same place. For example, a 7-night cruise from Southampton, or maybe a 7-night cruise from Barcelona, or maybe a 7-night cruise from Miami. That's a slightly different logic to the main purpose of an ocean liner, which is primarily to carry and transport passengers from one place to another. In the case of the Queen Mary 2, it's to carry passengers from 2 continents, usually between Europe and America. This ship was designed specifically for crossing the North Atlantic, with the route from New York to Southampton and in reverse being offered almost all year round. Before boarding the ship, I did do some research to try and understand a little more about the ship that I was going to be experiencing. One of the platforms that I used for my research was a YouTube platform by Chris Frame. Chris is an Australian maritime history author, and he creates loads of really interesting content on so many ships, one being QM2. One video that I really enjoyed, which I'll link down in the description, was an interview with Stephen Payne, the chief naval architect who led the project to design Queen Mary 2. In this, he highlights some really interesting features of the ship's design. The position of the onboard storerooms dictates where the galley has to be on the ship. The galley then dictates where the main dining room goes, and Payne highlighted that he wanted the dining room on board to be situated about 2/3 aft, or 2/3 of the way towards the back of the ship, which is the balance point for the motion of this ship. In other words, you'd feel the least motion in the dining room if it was positioned here. The same logic was applied to the positioning of the duplex apartments on board. They're also found 2/3 of the way along the length of the ship in order to minimise motion for those paying the money to stay there. A significant design challenge then quickly presented itself. If the dining room is 2/3 towards the back of the ship, how would passengers get from one side of it to the other when the size of the dining room covers the entire width of the ship? Well, the team came up with the idea to install 2 hidden walkways that would take passengers the length of the dining room to come up at the other side. These run along either side of the ship for just the length of the Britannia restaurant, and you'll find them titled Deck 3L on a ship deck plan. It's clever, isn't it? There's loads of little things like that all around the ship that remind you that this isn't a typical massive cruise ship. It's a very bespoke built ocean liner. Even the design of the funnel is different due to the route the ship covers. If you've watched my embarkation day video, you'll know that you pass under a huge bridge when you leave and also when you enter New York City. The design of the funnel had to be just right to allow the ship to pass underneath the bridge specifically. Otherwise, there would have been pretty big issues with Queen Mary 2 operating on the transatlantic route. Don't worry, I'm not going to get overly technical about any of this because, to be honest, I'm not the best placed person to do that. However, if you'd like to learn more, please head over to Chris's YouTube channel, which I'll link down in the description of this video. So, that covers the ship itself. Let's talk about what actually happened on the route on this cruise. As we've already covered, there aren't any planned stops on the traditional transatlantic route between New York and Southampton. The whole crossing takes 7 nights, and usually once you leave land on day 1, you don't then see it again until you arrive at the end. However, 2 days after leaving New York, we had a medical emergency on board and needed to disembark the passenger before we could then head out into the Atlantic. Our nearest land was Halifax, Nova Scotia, and so this was where the ship altered course to in order to disembark the passenger. We arrived in Halifax late in the evening, disembarked the passenger using the ship's lifeboats, and then we were on our way by morning. It did feel really strange seeing land again, especially when I'd mentally told myself that we wouldn't be seeing it again for the rest of the week. I did really like seeing Halifax again though, because I visited a few months ago on another cruise and I had a really great time there. I wondered why we didn't opt for a faster, maybe more efficient helicopter evacuation and instead chose to lower the ship's lifeboats to take the passenger ashore. The crew on board then told us later that the reason for that was due to the weather in Halifax. As I mentioned earlier, I was on this ship in the middle of winter, and in that part of the world it gets pretty cold, and apparently if you use a helicopter it would then put the patient at a far greater level of risk because it would just be so cold. As I woke up the following morning, I couldn't help but just hope that everything had went okay with that passenger in Canada. It must be so stressful to get evacuated from a cruise ship, especially when you end up in a place that's totally different from where the cruise started or finished. After we left Halifax, we were then full steam ahead and we arrived in Southampton right on time. I've got to say that the feeling of arriving in Southampton on the QM2 is totally different to the feeling of arriving on any other ship. It really does feel like you've completed some sort of historic transit. I felt a sense of pride leaving this ship that I genuinely have never felt leaving any cruise before. Before we move on to talk about the money side of things, let me tell you about the Cruise Maps. The Cruise Maps are a company offering bespoke, satellite precision customised cruise maps. What does this mean? Well, imagine coming home from your cruise and then receiving a beautiful map of the cruise you've just taken which you could then either display in a frame, or you could keep a digital copy. Pretty cool, right? I've got one on the wall behind me when I'm working from a cruise I took a few months ago, and I love looking at it and remembering such a great trip. The thing that makes these maps different to pretty much anything else out there is that they map the exact route your ship took while you were on board. For example, my trip on Queen Mary 2 would show the exact point at which the ship rerouted to Halifax and then proceeded on afterwards, rather than some generic print showing New York to Southampton. If you'd like to order anything from the cruise maps, you can do so via their website, and if you use my exclusive discount code FraserAtSea, all one word, then you'll receive a 10% discount on your order. Shipping is totally included globally, and you can use this discount code as many times as you like on both physical and digital products. One final point, don't worry if you've previously taken a cruise that you'd like to map, because the data from the cruise maps goes all the way back to early 2015 at the point of recording this video. So if you've been on a cruise since the start of 2015, that would apply to you. So remember, thecruisemaps.com, and the code you need is FraserAtSea, and that will secure you 10% off your order. Moving on, let's look at how much I paid for this cruise. My base fare for the crossing was £1,048 or $1,357 which I felt was pretty decent value, especially considering I was travelling solo. I've previously found that Cunard aren't very good with solo travellers paying a fair rate, so I wasn't overly upset by this price at all. The only added cost that I had to consider was gratuities, or the service charge as Cunard calls it. This was $16 per night for guests in the cabin grade that I was staying in, so a total of $112 or £86. This then brought my total cruise fare to £1,134 or £162 per night, or $1,469 or $210 per night. Let's look briefly at the cabin that I got for that price. I spent my time on board Queen Mary 2 in an inside cabin on deck 5 of the ship. I was allocated cabin 5183, which put me 2 decks above the Queen's room towards the back of the ship. I won't give too much away here because I did film a full review of this cabin, but overall I wasn't overly impressed with the room itself. First impressions were decent, but digging a little deeper found broken amenities, damaged fittings in the bathroom, and generally a pretty low standard from a housekeeping point of view. If you'd like to see my full cabin tour, I'll leave a link down in the description of this video and you can check it out after. Let's now move on to talk about the 3 concerns that I mentioned earlier: formality, motion, and boredom. Starting with formality, I had cruised with Cunard previously on Queen Elizabeth, and I met loads of people on there who told me a cruise on Queen Mary 2, or the Mary as she was affectionately known, would be much more formal than what I'd found on Queen Elizabeth. This really concerned me, because while I've started to enjoy formal nights more recently, I don't want to be formal every single night of my cruise. I found the experience on Queen Mary 2 to be largely similar to what I saw on Queen Elizabeth, so I didn't necessarily find the advice I'd received from people to be true. Every evening, the ship implements a smart attire dress code, meaning that you have to be smartly dressed to be in the main venues and lounges on board. By smartly dressed, don't worry, I don't mean ball gowns and tuxes every single night. You can quite easily wear trousers and an open-neck shirt. What's really annoying is that the crew will ask you to move on from a venue if you're not adequately dressed. Now, while I do understand this, there were some examples, one in particular, where I totally lost track of time on a sea day. I went to a bar to relax with a glass of wine before dinner. Right after I ordered it, and went and sat down on a sofa, the same member of staff who had just charged me for the drink came over and asked me to leave because I wasn't wearing smart attire. Now, I do think that in that example, the crew really should be warning you before you even order your drink, rather than getting you to pay the money and then having to retreat back to your cosy little inside cabin with your glass of wine. On 2 nights of the Transatlantic, our dress code was a little more formal. The dress code on these nights was explained as gala attire. For these evenings, it was totally common practice to see people wearing full black tie, and lots of the women were wearing ball gowns. One of our more formal nights was just branded as a gala night, but the other was branded as a black and white theme night, with little nods to the theme being all over the ship. They even had cocktails at one of the bars inspired by the theme, which I thought was a really nice touch. I found it really lovely how Cunard dressed the ship to suit the theme. It wasn't too over the top, but for example, there were some banners and signage in the Queen's room. There was different displays of fresh flowers in some of the venues. So for example, on Black and White Night, there was black and white accents added to bouquets. It was such a nice touch, and it really helped to create a sense of occasion on board. I did find it really nice to be on a ship with so many people getting involved in the formal nights, but it's really important that you think about them before you cruise, because I can't think of anything worse than getting on board and not having anything formal to wear. Generally speaking, I'd say that most of the guests on board seem to really enjoy dressing up for these nights, but don't worry if that's not your scene. There's a number of venues on board the ship that you can go to if you don't want to dress up. These include the King's Court Buffet, the Golden Lion Pub, the Casino, the Corinthia Lounge, and G32, which is used as the onboard nightclub. My second concern before boarding the ship was on the topic of motion. As we were crossing the North Atlantic in winter, I was really worried that we'd spend the whole 7 nights being flung around with the waves. However, I was absolutely delighted to find that the ship handled the ocean perfectly. After all, she is a world-famous ocean liner, so if she didn't handle the ocean well, I'd be pretty concerned. We did have one night where the hygiene bags, yes, you know what they are for, were available through all the corridors and the elevator lobbies, but after that one night, they were taken away, and it was business as normal. Ocean liners travel much faster than cruise ships, and I found it amazing to sit by the huge windows all over the ship and just watch us gliding through the water. At points, I honestly couldn't believe that we were sailing through the North Atlantic. On the point of views, there's also a stunning observation deck just beneath the bridge on deck 11, and a great space at the front of the promenade deck on deck 7. Fun fact, there's even a set of ship's propellers out here that are carried as spare. They're affectionately nicknamed the Captain's Cufflinks, so make sure that during your cruise you head outside and get a picture taken with them. Back to movement. Of course, feeling movement on board will be totally subject to the weather conditions outside, but I was super impressed. I'd felt it much worse when crossing the Atlantic on board Valiant Lady, the Virgin cruise ship, and that was much further south. The final pre-cruise concern I had that I want to tell you about today was boredom. What was there to do on a ship like Queen Mary 2 when you're on it for such a long time with no break? Would I get bored, or would I actually find myself really busy throughout the day? I'd say that a wintry transatlantic crossing is a really great way to test the onboard facilities and the overall guest experience, because you don't have the luxury of spending a full day lying outside baking in the sun on the open decks. I can imagine it must be absolutely glorious doing this route in the summer season when you can lie up on the top deck, top up your tan and relax. But when the weather doesn't allow that to happen, things need to be going on throughout the ship to prevent people getting bored. There were a few people trying to brave the weather in the outdoor pool at the back of the ship during my cruise, but not me. There were also a few more spending time at the pool indoors. However, I didn't think the indoor pool area actually held a heat very well at all, so I tended to just go up there while I was out for a walk, rather than spending any time actually sitting up there. I'd pass through the indoor pool as part of my daily walk to, can you guess? The kennels. Yes, you can actually take a dog on Queen Mary 2, and I loved taking a walk past and seeing the dogs on my way across the ocean. It was so great to see. Before we talk about the daily schedule of events and what you can do on board, we really need to stick on this topic of walks for a moment to talk about the promenade deck. I found the promenade on this ship to be probably the busiest I've ever seen on any ship. There seemed to be such a strong routine for people to get out there and do their laps of the deck every single day, and I absolutely loved it. By the time it got to day 2 or day 3, you were actually able to recognise people as you walked round, and everyone would be saying good morning, hello, asking how your day was. I absolutely loved it out there. I do go out on a cruise ship promenade deck most days to do a lap or two, but I just really enjoyed how it was such a thing for so many people to get out there and pound those decks for, in some cases, quite a number of laps. Anyway, every evening, your daily schedule is delivered to your cabin. One of my favourite things to do on any cruise is to lie in bed at night with my daily schedule and mark off everything with a pen that I want to do the following day. I then wake up the following morning and review that list again just in case I've slept on it and want to delete anything or add anything, and then I go and crack on with my day and try and achieve it all. I always find it really funny. I'm meant to be on holiday to relax, but I actually spend almost every day on a cruise running around constantly trying to do everything. During the day on Queen Mary 2, there's so much going on to keep yourself occupied. I'll upload more to my website at fraser@sea.com to allow you to see more detail for yourself, but some examples of activities include dance lessons where you can learn how to ballroom dance, to then maybe think about showcasing your skills at night in the Queen's Room later in the cruise. This seemed to be so popular every time it would be on, but no, my 2 left feet didn't make it anywhere near that dance floor. You could attend the Cunard Insights talks. These are talks that are run daily in the main theatre on board when a guest is invited to present a lecture on a given topic. These events will often feature pretty famous faces. On my trip, Alan Cummings was on board and ran a Q&A and also a screening of a movie that he's been working on. It was such a fantastic way to pass a few hours. The Q&A was fascinating. He had a conversation on stage with the cruise director about his life, his career, so many other elements, and then moving microphones were used to capture questions from the audience. This was such an engaging event. We also had Roger McGinn on board, who was the frontman and the leader of a band called The Birds. While they're not really my era, it was great to go along and just pass a bit of time listening to someone else tell us about what has been a pretty amazing life. You could also check out a Zumba class, try a bridge lesson, go on a wine tasting, try your hands at aerobics, go to a watercolour art class, go to a golf competition, yes, golf, play bingo, go to a classical concert with one of the live Cunard musicians, or maybe you'd like to put your knowledge to the test at one of the many trivia competitions. Don't worry, I'm not done with this list yet. There's so much more still to come. You could join the Queen Mary 2 passenger choir for your cruise. You could maybe watch live sports in the pub, go to an art talk, watch a matinee performance in the theatre, play darts. The list, you get it, is almost endless on here. I was very impressed with how much was available to do every single day of the crossing. A really unique feature on board Queen Mary 2 that I haven't seen on any other ships is the onboard Planetarium, which you'll find towards the front of Deck 4. The Planetarium on board is the largest at sea, and shows in here are totally included in your cruise fare. In my experience, the quality of what's being shown in here is really high, and you'll sometimes have up to 4 shows a day to go and see, and they'll all be different. The whole experience is like nothing that I've ever seen at sea before, so if you are planning to cruise on here, make sure you go and check it out. Inside the Planetarium, the seats are 2 different colours. It's the red ones that you need to sit in if you're there for one of the shows using the dome. If it's a lecture or another type of performance that you're there for, you can sit anywhere. The fact that Queen Mary 2 has this Planetarium theatre venue, in addition to the main theatre, really blew my mind when I first saw it. This Planetarium is probably similar sizes to the main theatres that I've seen on so many other cruise ships. If you'd rather just switch off and relax, the ship's also got a brilliant spa at the front of Deck 7. In here, you'll find the usual treatment rooms, but also a great thermal suite with a hydrotherapy pool and a relaxation area. You'll also find the usual sauna, steam room set up in here, and that also has a number of sensory showers as well. During my time on board, you could buy a 2-hour access pass for $59, which I did think was pretty decent value. There were a couple of things in there that were out of order when I was on board, but to be honest, everything seemed to be in pretty decent working order. The final point I'd make on what you can do on board is that you need to set some time aside to just explore the ship. It's absolutely amazing, and it's so different to any other ship that I've ever been on. There are displays all around the ship, turning Queen Mary 2 into what is essentially a bit of a museum in her own right. You can find out so much more about the ports that she's been to in the past, some of her famous previous passengers, and so much more, just by wandering round the corridors. It was while walking the corridors that I also came across the bridge viewing area. You're not allowed to take any photos or videos in there for pretty obvious reasons, so I can't actually show you what's inside, but honestly, it is so cool to be standing up looking directly into the bridge during the day when the ship's at sea. It's awesome. The bridge viewing area is open between the hours of 9 and 4 on all of the sea days, which, in the case of the Transatlantic Crossing, is every single day. Next, let's talk about food. How was the quality of the dining operation during the crossing? Well, I've read some pretty mixed reviews on Queen Mary 2 recently, with quite a few of them slating the food in particular. This isn't at all what I found on board, and I did feel like everything I ate was of really good quality. I didn't really see any differences between the quality of my dining experiences on here and on Queen Elizabeth, which might suggest that the consistency across the Cunard fleet could be at a pretty decent level. If you'd like to learn more about the food on my cruise, I've also released a full dining guide for this ship here on my YouTube channel. You can find the link below in the description of this video. You're probably getting the picture throughout this video that I really enjoyed my time on board. But what didn't I like? Now, there were a few things. First, the ship felt busy in parts. This is understandable because at full capacity, she can carry over 2,600 guests, and they all need to eat and they all need to drink. However, some venues verged on ridiculous at times. For example, lunch at the pub was so difficult unless you were willing to go down hours before lunch would begin. This was largely due to the fact that people seem to enjoy spending time just relaxing in there, not necessarily waiting for lunch, but just sitting reading a book or meeting up with friends, and that therefore blocked the opportunity to dine there. During my 7 nights on board, I never managed to get a seat at the Golden Lion pub, and after I realised it was full on my first sea day, I then made a point of going down about 30 minutes before lunch started, and at no point did I manage to get a chair. I even came back multiple days, an hour into the lunch, and still couldn't sit down. What I ended up doing was standing at the bar to order and eat my dinner, which, while that's fine for me, really isn't ideal because I know so many people that just simply could not stay standing up during the entirety of their meal, and that felt a little bit ridiculous. The next thing I didn't like on my Transatlantic Crossing was the handling of immigration. It was a requirement for immigration checks to be completed on the ship, and it blew my mind how long this took. I guess it saves the effort of doing it on land once the ship arrives into Southampton, but oh my goodness, it felt as though it took forever. The way it worked was each group of cabins was allocated a certain time to go down for the checks. So for example, all of the cabins on deck 5 would be given one time, and all of the cabins on deck 6 would be given another time, and so on and so forth. The checks themselves then took place in the Britannia restaurant, but I joined the line way back on the other side of the main atrium. I don't know if it's a Cunard idea or if it's a British immigration policy that passengers have to be checked before they arrive, but honestly, the handling of it just felt a bit disorganised, a bit chaotic, and it felt as though we were queuing for so much longer than what would have been necessary. The final thing I'd mention that I didn't really enjoy on this cruise was the level of service in some areas. An example I'd give is room service. After a couple of failed attempts at ordering room service because my phone call just wasn't being answered, I thought, I'm just going to stay on the phone and see how long it takes me to get an order submitted. I was then absolutely horrified to find that it often took over half an hour for the phone to even be picked up, and I was then met with waits of well over an hour, multiple times, to have food delivered to the room. That felt a bit mad because on other ships that I've been on, room service has always been such an easy thing to acquire because everyone seems to be out in the other dining venues. The saving grace I would give is that this experience wasn't consistent. It seemed to be some parts of the day that were far worse than others, so it wasn't every single time I would phone that I was being met with this, but yeah, not what I was expecting for the Queen Mary 2. Finally, would I take another trip on Queen Mary 2, and would I recommend the experience to you? Well, in a word, yes. I felt on this ship a feeling that I've never ever felt on a ship before. The whole experience just felt so special, and I was on board just before Christmas and every single venue looked beautiful. Yes, there were a few annoyances during my trip, but I'd be lying to you if I said that I didn't get a bit frustrated by many things on pretty much every single cruise I've ever taken. If you'd like to see more from my time on this ship and so many others, then please do support my channel by clicking the subscribe button. If you've enjoyed this video today, please also jump down below and give it your thumbs up. Both the like and subscribe buttons massively help my channel to grow and help my content to reach more people. So thank you to anybody who clicks either or both of them. Finally, now that we've spoken about my full experience on board Queen Mary 2, going from New York to Southampton, why not let me show you a little bit more of what it was like firsthand? Come and join me in this video. Here, I'll take you with me on embarkation day as we head from Manhattan over to Brooklyn, onto the ship, and then we kick off from the berth and start what was going to be a pretty amazing trip. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you over there.